Welcome back, everyone, to the second part of this white genocide or replacement conspiracy theory and why it's a conspiracy theory. This video, we're going to go over the statistics. So this one I wanted to go over real quick is from the Southern Poverty Law. It says the Southern Poverty Law Center poll finds substantial support for Great Replacement theory and other hard right ideas. I want to sort of skim through this. So the SLP survey was not designed to simply measure prejudice or bigotry. Instead, we set out to examine to what degree people in certain groups feel threatened or persecuted by members of a defined outgroup. The belief that one group of people is inherently harmful to your own is foundational to extremism, as is the idea that well-being and survival of the in-group depends on taking hostile action against those who supposedly threaten it. The man allegedly responsible for the shooting at the supermarket in Buffalo, for example, argued that Jews, immigrants, and Latinos, in addition to black people he targeted, pose an existential threat. And I think they're using the word existential incorrectly there, but maybe that's because I'm into existential philosophy. To the white race, leading him to conclude that fighting is the only way. Hostile actions against an outgroup can take the forms of violence, like terrorist attacks, but it can also include conduct like abusive language or discriminatory and dehumanizing legislation. In addition to extremist narratives, our survey looked at levels of partisanship tolerance for anti-democratic actions and expressions of approval for different kinds of political violence that we found was a great deal of hostility for people on the other side of the political aisle. A majority of both Republicans and Democrats believe their political opponents pose a threat to the country and want to harm their political opponents. That kind of animosity could fuel partisan violence, a possibility that our results suggest we should take seriously. When we asked respondents if they approved of threatening or assassinating a politician, for example, roughly 1 in 5 said they at least somewhat approved. Very disturbing. Their test group was kind of small. I think it was like 1,500 or something like that. But while levels of support threats and violence generally do not differ substantially among partisan Republicans, are more likely to agree that some violence may be necessary to get the country back on track. The mood overall is pessimistic. 44% of Americans agree that the U.S. seems headed toward a civil war in the near future, including 53% of Republicans and 39% of Democrats. On the right, our polls suggest a pervasive sense not only that America has lost touch with traditional values, but that societal changes pose a danger to society and, in some cases, white Americans in particular. Right-leaning Americans are more likely to view movements aimed at building an equitable society, including feminism and the Black Lives Matter movement, as threatening. Many believe that elements of today's political environment, including the 2020 racial justice protest and demographic changes, unfairly malign or threaten white people. This is combined with pervasive distrust of democratic institutions and feelings that more conservative Americans are being persecuted by the government and the political left. Each side has radically different visions of America. On the right, a large faction is invested in pushing back against the pluralism and equity, while the left largely embraces those values. Our survey shows that the hard right could make greater political gains and in the process further erode our democracy and create conditions through activism, policy, and violence that would disproportionately harm communities that continue to be marginalized in our society. No political outcomes are inevitable, but our results show that a substantial effort on the part of activists, institutions, and government will be required if we hope to secure multicultural democracy and prevent partisan violence. The Great Replacement hostility to diversity, the Great Replacement narrative, provides the central framework for the global white supremacist movement. The racist conspiracy says there is a systemic global effort to replace white European people with non-white foreign populations. The ultimate goal of those responsible Democrats, leftists, multiculturalists, and at times Jews is to reduce white political power and ultimately to eradicate the white race. The theory has motivated multiple terror attacks, including the 2018 attack at the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania Tree of Life Synagogue, the 2019 attacks at 2 Christchurch, New Zealand mosques, and El Paso, Texas Walmart, and most recently an attack targeting Black people at the supermarket in Buffalo, New York. As America's demographics have shifted, the narrative of white replacement has become ingrained in the rhetoric of right-wing pundits and an increasingly extreme wing of the Republican Party. This administration wants complete open borders, and you have to ask yourself why. U.S. Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin asked during a Fox News segment. There's something very specifically that I'm looking for. 67% believe the country's demographic changes are being orchestrated by liberal leaders actively trying to leverage political power by replacing more conservative white voters. Republican responses were in stark contrast to those self-identified Democrats, 64% of whom say they find the country's increasing diversity to be at least a somewhat positive development, 25% who say demographic changes represent a threat to white Americans, and 35% who say those changes are being orchestrated by liberals. Even though the percentage of the respondents who view demographic changes negatively rose slightly since we first asked about people's views on the issue in August of 2020, a far lower percentage of Americans say they are concerned about immigration, 50% as compared to 64%. The decline is perhaps a result of President Trump, who relentlessly stoked anti-immigration or anti-immigrant hysteria no longer being in office, but that decline could also, in part, mean that those on the right are less concerned with immigration specifically than they are with the supposed progression of the progressive and liberal plot to use immigrants to erode the power of more conservative whites. And one thing that's really interesting about that is that the Hispanic Latino community is very conservative. That's because, from a cultural standpoint, they are very Catholic, and this is why we look like these people have families of a lot of kids, like 5, 10, 15 kids. They're very Catholic. They don't believe in contraceptives. They usually don't. Very family oriented, which for some reason culturally whites have lost touch with the notion of. I mean, a lot of people, I think that white people. I'm speaking culturally. It really has nothing to do with skin tone, but white people have seemed to take this up quite a bit, is that, when you're 18, it's like, get the fuck out. We're done with you. And a lot of the times Hispanic and Black people tend to gravitate more towards a cultural leaning of family stability. So if someone in the family is struggling, usually they act as a family unit. There's a sense of community camaraderie, and it doesn't matter how old they are, they're still going to stand with them and be supportive. White people that seems to be lost. It actually used to be a part of white culture as well, or a cultural leaning that white people leaned towards. Now white people seem to have this sort of self-entitlement, overinflated ego kind of, quite often the case is, you're 18, get the fuck out. Doesn't matter if you're financially stable enough to take care of yourself or not. And then you're like, why are people not reproducing? Well, we have a tendency to not take care of our family anymore. Communally, there's just no, there's no community, there's no camaraderie. But surprisingly, believe it or not, the black population tends to culturally lean very conservative. Again, religious purposes, religious reasons. Culturally they tend to identify with, Christianity. And so they have a lot of very, very conservative leaning ideas, believe it or not. Like I said, so do Hispanic and Latinos, very Catholic based culture. Not all, we're talking about culture. Culture is not tied to ethnicity or race. It's just, that's very prevalent in South America as Catholicism. And black people here in the United States, it's been pushed upon them very, very heavily, the concept of Christianity. I think if you let those religious philosophies go, you start seeing things rationally. Unfortunately, I think in a rational sense, I don't think we should give up on family or community and be able to support each other. I think that's important. But these are some interesting charts. So this is the demographic makeup of America is changing and becoming more diverse, with U.S. Census estimating white people will be a minority in approximately 25 years, generally speaking. Do you find these changes to be very positive, somewhat negative, or very negative? And I'm not trying to sound like another YouTuber here, because there was another YouTuber that commented this. Personally, I'm neutral. And they don't have that option on this. There's no option for neutral. I'm neutral. I don't see it as a pro. I don't see it as a negative. This is something that's happening. And there's a lot of polls in here. I've gone over them. Other YouTubers have gone over them. It's just showing the amount of people who believe in the great replacement. This pro-negative, predominantly. It's Republicans that are really like, this is bad, and if you look through this these charts, obviously the Republican Party is greatly concerned. But surprisingly, there's a good portion of older Republicans that aren't very concerned about this. And of course, Democrats don't seem to be very affected or concerned about this, except for younger ones. That's interesting. But I really wanted to focus on, so the generation, this guy in this article was talking about, this goes to the 2017 statistics, and I think they mentioned Projections showed that white population declining after 2023. This guy has written several articles, and this is not the one that I was looking for, but basically, he was projecting that, so what he's calling Gen Z plus, people under like 10 years and younger are going to be a minority. And he says that in something like 44 years from now, white people will be a literal minority if we adjust for birth rates versus death rates kind of thing. But that's it. It gets even more interesting, and why this is, it's not genocidal or replacement. There seems to be a lack of people age 24 and younger in the white crowd have just kind of went poof, and nobody gives an explanation why. It's like, okay, what was it? COVID? Or is it reproduction? What is it? This is elusive and something I find strange. But no, it gets even worse in the sense that this is totally a conspiracy. First, let me go over ghost DNA. I was talking about this in the first video. The ghost DNA in West Africans complicates human history. So, about 50,000 years ago, ancient humans in what is now West Africa apparently procreated with another group of ancient humans that scientists didn't know existed. Okay, so this is what the ghost DNA is. It's not that, they have a genetic marker that is a mutation or adaptation or something like that, or a process of evolution. There aren't. It's just like it says right here. West Africa apparently procreated with another group of ancient humans that scientists didn't know existed. That's why they're calling it ghost DNA. There aren't any bones or ancient DNA to prove it, but researchers say the evidence is in the genes of modern West Africans. They analyzed genetic material from hundreds of people from Nigeria to Syria, Leone, and found signals of what they call ghost DNA from an unknown ancestor. Our own species, Homo sapiens, lived alongside other groups that split off from the same genetic family tree at different times, and there's plenty of evidence from other parts of the world that early humans had sex with other hominins like Neanderthals. That's why Neanderthal genes are present in humans today in people of European and Asian descent. Homo sapiens also mated with another group, the Denisovans, and those genes are found in people from Oceania. The findings on ghost DNA published in the journal Science Advances further complicate the picture of how Homo sapiens and modern humans evolved away from other human relatives. It's almost certainly the case that the story is incredibly complex and complicated, and we have kind of these initial hints about the complexity. The scientists analyzed the genomes of 405 West Africans. I don't know how to say this person's name. Sankaraman says I guess I don't need to. They use statistical model, 5 parts of the DNA, blah, 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 blah. So scientists think that interbreeding happened about 50,000 years ago, roughly the same time that Neanderthals were breeding with modern humans elsewhere in the world. It's not clear whether there was a single interbreeding event, though, or whether it happened over an extended period of time. The unknown group appears to have split from the ancestors of modern humans a little before when Neanderthals split off from our ancestors. So we know what it is. This, I'm just calling it ghost DNA. I wanted to get that out of the way. And this is, I love this map. This shows like the migration of people. So we start off in Africa, we move up here, and I know that when we got to Asia, we split. So we split two different ways. We split two different ways in Europe, split again up here, split again when we come down here. This was the Human Genome Project, and it still validates that, yes, Africa is the cradle of life. There's a cute little video about the Human Genome Project, and the more and more that we do DNA tests, the more and more we're finding out about each other, and it's really, really, really blurring the lines of what we think of when we think of race and ethnicity. I studied color theory, and I would say human beings, like what we perceive as white, we're actually not white. We're on a scale of brown, and what we perceive as black people, not actually black. Again, it's a very dark brown. If you were to take the darkest human being you could find, blackest of black, perceivably what we call black human being, the darkest one you could find, all the way to the lightest colored human being you could find, and you just started at the dark and went a little bit lighter, 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 all the way to the lightest. You would have a perfect color spectrum of the color of brown, just a perfect brown scale from lightest to dark, dark to light. I mean, it would literally just bleed across. And looking at that, you would get that ability to look at this lineup of people and say, when does, the sort of tannish, whatever color white people are, sort of, it is a variation brown, stop being white and become black. It transitions. It doesn't just stop and then black. That's not how it works. It is a cascade. It is a spectrum. It's a beautifully perfect spectrum of brown. That's what it is. Blue and green does the same thing. I don't know if you know this, but in pigment, literal black in pigment is the combination of all colors. White is the absence of all colors when we're talking about pigment. And then when we're talking about the light spectrum, black is the absence of all color, and white is the combination of all color. So black and white, when we're talking about pigment and light spectrum, are one and the same. Like, it's really interesting. But a lot of like the sort of colors that we see, the base colors that create this menagerie of colors, you put them together, it creates a cascade. It creates that's why, the grayscale. That's why we have a grayscale. Like, the lightest of light gray looks white, but it's part of the grayscale. It's the lightest gray you can find, and you can cascade it all the way to the darkest gray, which almost looks what a lot of people probably perceive as black. Pretty much every color does this. Every color. So that's interesting. So I will have the links to all these articles in the description. I also left them in the first video as well. So which one was this? The Americans say declining share of white people in the U.S. is neither good nor bad for society. Saying the majority of society doesn't really care about the shift of demographics. There is a very specific chart that I'm looking for, and for some reason I can't find it. I don't know. Oh, and you might, comes from this guy, this conservative guy who's writing about this. This is from Brookings EDU. So, a new minority white generation. A second noteworthy finding from the new census estimate is that for the first time, minorities outnumber whites nationally for each age under 10, while earlier estimates revealed minority white status for some of these youthful ages. This is now solidly the case for individuals born in each year since 2007. And they show a graph, percent white by age group. And this is the amount that's under the white. So here's 75 and plus, white is way my majority, but under the age of 10, it's just it says it's somewhere below 50%, just a little bit. But here's the big kicker: Generation Z plus race ethnic profile. It says 49.6% white. That's not a minority. And the reason why they're calling it a minority is because it's only a minority if you take all the other racial, it's with all the other racial categories combined, whites will be a minority at 49.6%. I mean, you could even change it to 40%. Whites are only a minority in the sense of all other races combined. But individually, Hispanics, blacks, Asians, etc., whites are still the majority to those other groups. So, let's say, you had 30% white, Hispanics would get close. So, you might have a balance between whites and Hispanics, maybe 30%. And then let's move blacks up, to, 20%, Asians, 10%, 2+ races, that'll probably go up. Native, that'll probably decrease, because continuously breeding forward, there's probably a lot of people with Native American lineage in them today. And that would still mean that whites are a majority, because they're only a minority in comparison to all the other races combined. But if you look at the percentage of whites to Hispanic Latinos, whites are majority to that. If you look at the percentage of whites to blacks, whites are still a majority to that. Same with Asians, etc. Now, I found out globally, Asians make up the highest percentage of the population globally. It's Asians. Asians triumph, have a higher population than whites, blacks, Hispanic. I find Hispanic Latino to be very interesting, because Hispanic Latino, the thing is you have Spain. This is the big issue. Spain is white people. They're Hispanic Latino. but they're not South American, which also identify as Hispanic Latino. But people don't consider them white. And they're not Mexican either, because not everyone from South America is Mexican. Really what you're looking at is a residual of Native Americans from South America. The majority of people in South America have a very, very high percentage of Native American DNA. They speak Spanish because, well, that's where the Spanish people ended up. So that's an interesting one. But I really wanted to show this 49.6%, and they're calling this a minority status. Well, it's only minority if you combine, like you would have to say Hispanics, Blacks, Asian, 2 races, and AM Indians, aka natives. You would have to combine that all and say other race. Then yes, we would be a minority. Then whites would be a minority. But that's not the case. In this chart, 49.6% is majority to Hispanics. Hispanics would still be the minority compared to whites. Blacks would still be a minority compared to whites. Asians would still be a minority compared to whites. So that's a really interesting twist in reading that kind of data. Then there is this, what was this one? Okay, I think this one has run its use. You feel free to look at this one and read through it. It's interesting. Don't be afraid to learn. Let's go to the dashboard. I wanted to show the dashboard. This is interesting. So, what you can do with this is you can click on these, and then you can so I clicked on Kansas, and I clicked on white alone %, and it tells you individually by state what the percentage is. So for Kansas, 86.3 white alone %, white alone non-Hispanic or Latino %, 75.4. The difference between these two is very vague. One might say that these white alone % would include white, Hispanic, Latino. I don't know about that, because then they have Hispanic or Latino, which is only 12.2%. Both of the white categories is pretty high. You know, this one is 86.3%, this one is 75.4%, and you have blacks, which is 6.1%, Native American 1.2%, Asian 3.2%, Pacific Islander 0.1%, biracial 3.1%, and then Hispanic Latino 12.2%. So, you know, I'm not seeing a minority status there. You can even click on under 5 years of age. But the one thing, so like, I mean, you go to something like Hawaii, let's get rid of that one. It's not showing me all at once. Boo. There we go. So here we have Hawaii, and if you break it down through this, so very, very low percentage of whites. Well, guess what? It's Hawaii. Whites only make the white alone is only 25.5%, and then the white alone, not Hispanic or Latino, 21.7%. The highest percentage is Asian, 37.6%. And that's because a lot of people from that area identify as Asian. Like, a lot of Native Hawaiians will identify as Asian. Pacific Islanders often identify as Asian. And then you have this Pacific Islander, for some reason, 10.1%. And then, biracial, 24.2%. Not a very large black community. Strange, oddly, not very many identify as Native American. But, this is Hawaii. It shouldn't be shocking. Shouldn't be shocking at all. The one that I found very interesting was this one, Puerto Rico. It's not part of the United States, but it's a territory. So here, Puerto Rico, white alone, percent 60. White alone, not Hispanic or Latino, 0.1. This is what caught my attention. Hispanic or Latino percent, 98.7. Now, why is that interesting? Puerto Rico has a very large black population. But according to this, black African American alone percent, 11.3. What this tells me is that you simultaneously have a black person and a white person simultaneously identifying as Hispanic or Latino. And I think what they're identifying with there is more a culture and a language. So, I think Hispanic, Latino language, culture. They're identifying with a culture, not really race or ethnicity, or, the color of their skin. And when I saw that, I thought, that's very interesting. Why don't we do that in the United States? And I think that's because the United States is interesting in the fact that we are multicultural. And so people have a tendency to predicate their identity on ethnicity or race. I think that's what's happening. And so instead of all this, if we put on the census, do you identify as American? And then list other things. I wonder if that percentage would be extremely high, like 80% or something like that. Because I bet you the majority of people who live in the United States just simply identify as American, which is tied to culture, not skin tone. And I think that's pretty much what America is becoming, is it's becoming basically what Puerto Rico did. Like this 98.7% Hispanic or Latino. And believe me, they do have a very large black population, but it's really weird when you look at the black population, only 11.3%. That's odd. I know people from Puerto Rico. I know people from there. Very large black population, far much more than 11.3%. They do speak Spanish. I mean, you will see these very dark people speaking Spanish. And it's almost like they don't think of themselves in terms of white or black. They're thinking of themselves in terms culturally. That I find extraordinarily interesting. But overall, you go through and you click on all of these states, and it's, again, majority white. Not minority, majority. And the only places where it is a minority are places where it makes sense. Like Hawaii. Well, okay. There's a lot of Native Hawaiians that are Pacific Islanders, and they're identifying as Asian. Which, that's technically correct. What's up with Idaho? %93%. 81.6%, 0.9, 1.7, 1.6, 0.2, 2.6, 12.8. Again, and it won't let me look at the ethnic groups or racial groups of under 5 for some reason. It won't let me look at that and see how many. So, don't know why. But the overall, here's your population estimate. 331,893,745. Not really the overall population. Yeah, over 300 million people in the United States. 300 million. And, you add 2 million to that, well, that changes it from 331 million to 333 million. It's hardly noticeable. Really, that's a fraction. Okay, so that was the big thing that I wanted to point out, was that 49.6%, which I found interesting. And then the statistic from the census on Puerto Rico said that is very interesting, 98.6%, when they have a much larger black population than 11.3%. Very strange. Like I said, what that tells me, well, it's not strange, it's interesting. It's sort of a beautiful thing. Tells me they're not paying attention to skin tone. They're paying attention to who is Hispanic, Latino. And here in the United States, it would be who is American, not your skin tone, who is an American. I think that's a much better way to go about doing it, and probably perpetuates less xenophobia and hatred. I'll leave the links to all this stuff in the description. Like I said, I left it in the previous video that's going to be in this one. This is why I say it's a conspiracy. There's just no... For the other aspect is that it's not deliberate. This is incidental. That white... And what they're talking about is an age group that's 10 and below. That could change. That could easily change. This is nothing out of the ordinary that we see spikes in population changes and downfalls in population changes. This is something that has been going on for a long time. It's just up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. If white supremacists were to look at population demographics from, let's say, the Middle Ages, they probably shriek in horror and be absolutely amazed that we're still here. Because you're talking about a bacteria that wiped out 3/4 of the world's population at that time. White people almost didn't make it, But, well, guess what? We're still here. So, stop panicking. Stop freaking out. I don't know why the population is so low. I don't think anyone knows. It probably has to do, a lot of what they're saying, it has a lot to do with people don't want to procreate. Like, not because of LGBT stuff. Heterosexual people don't want to procreate. They don't want a kid. They actively don't want one. You should be asking yourself why. I don't think it's religious. It's biological organisms' best interest to procreate, to survive and proliferate, right? So, why? This is what I mean. This could change. People aren't done procreating. You might have a low percentage or birth rate of whites in 10 below now, and then 10 years later, see a huge spike. Have something like what my dad's generation is, the baby boomers. So who knows? I don't think it's up to other racial categories to accommodate for this. I think if white people want to save the white race, well, then you probably ought to be advocating for policies that make it easier to reproduce. Because right now it's hard. I mean, I barely have time to take a shit, let alone take care of a child. And that's another thing. Who was it that passed a bunch of legislation and policy making it pretty much impossible for LGBT people to find a surrogate mother? I'd have to get a lawyer to do that. That's expensive. Well, that would be the Republicans that did stuff like that. You keep doing these things that make it incredibly unappealing or almost impossible to have a child. It's like, why? Why would I do this? Why would I have a child? It's not in my best interest for survival's sake anymore. Like, I got to survive in this society, and I barely have time to even breathe. Let alone do I have time to take care of a child. And I think that there is a big difference between living in a rural area and living in a more populated area like a major city. Big difference. And I think it's the people in the cities that are really struggling. People in rural areas, life is very different. It is. And I think this is where we're seeing a headbutting, is because of those differences between living in a populated area versus a rural area. I almost think that Congress should be divided on that line. It shouldn't be the Republicans and the Democrats. It should be representation of rural citizens and representation of major city citizens, because we do need different policies. The policies that we need in major cities would not work in rural area. And policies that would be beneficial for people in the rural areas would not be beneficial for people in the cities. And I think that's where a lot of major headbutting comes from. So, no, it's not genocide. It's not replacement. It's not deliberate. It's incidental. That's the problem. That's why it's a conspiracy theory. Because nobody's deliberately going out of their way to diminish the white race. For some reason, the white race is not appropriating. What do? I can tell you one thing. Being violent towards other people, not helpful. Not helpful. Now, if you have legitimate concerns And I think if you brought that up and had an adult conversation with civility and wanted to actually sit down and talk about this and use like actual empirical data and logic and reasoning to talk about this, I don't think people would be calling you racist or anything like that. I think they'd see you as just somebody bringing up a legitimate concern. Personally, I'm not concerned. Like I said, genetic lineages live on. Everything has an expiration date. White people do, black people do, Hispanic, Asian, everything. Humankind in general has an expiration date. The earth has an expiration date. You know, all you can really do is live in the moment and try to make the best out of what you got. And I don't think we're very good at doing that. I think we're really good at making life as miserable, making what we have in the moment as miserable as possible. And I don't know why. All right, so like, share, subscribe, comment, all that stuff. And with that, I'm out.